The music boomed through the office, vibrating the walls and making every glass shimmer under the dim, colored lights. Tonight was meant to be unforgettable, a celebration of hitting 100,000 services sold. My wife Lydia had organized everything, and it showed. She thrived on nights like these, making people feel at ease, crafting moments that felt bigger than life. The party had everything: catered food, flowing drinks, and a contagious energy that pulled everyone into its orbit. It wasn't just a celebration for the company. It felt personal. Lydia had spent weeks planning every detail, insisting this night would set the tone for the future. She had a way of turning the smallest things into a statement, and this night was no exception. I'd arrived early to help set up, and by the time the first wave of employees showed up, I was already a couple of drinks deep. I figured it was fine. Saturday night, right? The booze flowed freely, and everyone was taking full advantage. Lydia was radiant, making the rounds with an effortless grace, laughing, dancing, and charming everyone in sight. Every time she caught my eye, she gave me that smile, the kind that made everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. Still, something gnawed at me, a strange feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe it was how lively she seemed tonight, almost too lively. Even for her, there was an intensity in the way she moved from group to group, never staying too long in one place, never missing a beat. Her laughter, louder than usual, felt forced, like it was a performance she needed to keep up. And every now and then, I noticed her glancing at Kevin, her boss, with what felt like familiarity. But I pushed the thought away, blaming the alcohol for my paranoia. We danced, we drank, we toasted. Lydia pulled me into conversations with coworkers, and every time she looked at me, her eyes sparkled as if to say, "This is what we've built together. This is ours." But the unease lingered at the edges of my mind like a shadow, just out of reach. By the time the evening began to blur into a haze of laughter, music, and clinking glasses, I felt my stomach turning. It wasn't just the whiskey. I'd been here since 9 a.m., and the exhaustion from setting up, drinking, and mingling was catching up with me. My head swam, and my legs wobbled. The lights suddenly seemed too bright, the room too loud. I felt the nausea hit like a wave crashing into my gut. I stumbled toward the bathroom, gripping the walls for support as I pushed past the crowd. I barely made it to the sink before everything I'd drunk that day came rushing back up. My head throbbed as I leaned against the cool porcelain, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When I finally looked up at myself in the mirror, I saw a man unraveling. My hair was disheveled, my shirt rumpled from the sweat and heat of the night. I wiped my mouth and tried to pull myself together, but the more I tried, the worse I felt. I knew I couldn't stay. I staggered out of the bathroom, hoping Lydia would understand. I found her near the bar, surrounded by co-workers, Kevin standing just a little too close to her. My vision blurred, and maybe I imagined it, but I thought I saw her hand brush his arm, casually, like it was nothing, just enough to make my stomach twist a little tighter. When she noticed me swaying on my feet, her smile flickered, replaced for a second by concern. "You okay?" she asked, her hand brushing lightly across my arm. "I think I need to go home," I muttered, the words slurring together. I expected her to say she'd come with me. She always did. Lydia never let me leave anywhere alone, especially after I'd been drinking. But tonight was different. Her face softened with understanding, too much understanding, and she gave me a gentle nudge toward the exit. "Go ahead, babe. You look awful. Get some rest." Her voice was sweet, soothing, but it was her next words that left a knot in my chest. "I'll stay a little longer, okay? Just to make sure everything's wrapped up." It was a reasonable thing to say. She'd organized the whole event, after all. Of course, she wanted to make sure everyone was taken care of. But it felt off. Lydia never stayed behind. We always left together. It was one of those small things that mattered, something we took pride in, being each other's constant. A dull sense of disappointment mixed with the nausea in my stomach. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping she'd change her mind, that she'd laugh and say, "Of course I'm coming with you, silly." But she just smiled, that same radiant smile she'd been flashing all night. "Yes, yes, go home. I'll be right behind you." I nodded, swallowing the unease that rose in my throat like bile. Maybe it was just the alcohol clouding my judgment. Maybe I was being selfish, expecting her to leave her own event just because I couldn't keep up. I gave her a weak smile and kissed her cheek before turning toward the door. The night air hit me like a slap, cooling the sweat on my skin as I stumbled toward my car. The streets were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the party's chaos. I slid into the driver's seat and leaned my head back, trying to gather enough strength to drive the short distance home. As I pulled away from the office, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the glow of the building recede into the distance. Something about leaving felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I chalked it up to paranoia, to the whiskey sloshing in my veins, and forced myself to focus on the road. By the time I got home, it was already 9. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the couch, popping a couple of pills for the headache building behind my eyes. The TV hummed softly in the background, some mindless show flickering across the screen. I tried to shake the strange feeling gnawing at me, but it lingered like a bad aftertaste. I closed my eyes, hoping a bit of sleep would help me feel better. But as I drifted off, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Lydia had smiled when she told me to leave. I had just started to drift off when my phone buzzed violently on the coffee table, rattling against the wood. Groggy and still trying to shake off the nausea, I grabbed it without thinking. It was Brian from work, a guy I wasn't particularly close with, but someone I trusted enough. His voice came through the line, frantic and slurred with alcohol. "She's in the boss's office, man. With Kevin," he shouted over the noise of music and muffled voices. "Your wife, she's in there with him. I swear to God, they've locked the door, man. You gotta get here now." My heart stopped, disbelief wrapping its cold fingers around me. For a second, I thought I hadn't heard him right. Lydia? With Kevin? It made no sense, but the desperation in Brian's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a joke. I sat upright, panic setting in fast. My head still throbbed, and my vision swam from the remnants of alcohol, but that didn't matter. I fumbled to grab my keys and bolted out the door. Every terrible possibility raced through my mind as I jumped into the driver's seat, the adrenaline hitting me harder than anything else I'd felt that night. I floored the gas, tires screeching as I peeled out of the driveway. The streets blurred as I sped toward the office, my pulse hammering in my ears. The cool night air did little to calm me. My hands shook on the wheel, gripping it so hard that my knuckles turned white. I tried to think logically, tried to convince myself that there had to be a misunderstanding, but Brian's voice echoed in my head, relentless. "She's in there with him." 20 minutes felt like an eternity. My mind spiraled, images flashing of Lydia in that locked office, alone with Kevin. I knew what people said about him, how he flirted with the women in the office, always towing the line just enough to stay out of trouble. Lydia had dismissed those rumors, told me he was just harmless. But now I couldn't tell what was real anymore. When I finally reached the office, the party was still going. People crowded near the door, some smoking, others laughing, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. The music blasted from inside, shaking the windows. Brian stumbled toward me as soon as I stepped out of the car, his face pale, his hair a mess. "She's still in there," he panted, pointing down the hall. "Kevin's office. I swear I saw them go in, and they locked the damn door." I didn't say a word. I shoved past the crowd at the entrance, my heartbeat drowning out the music. All I could think about was Lydia, what she was doing, what I might find on the other side of that door. My entire body thrummed with rage and disbelief. I told myself I'd get answers, no matter what it took. When I reached Kevin's office door, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle and twisted hard. Locked. Of course. That only fueled my anger. Without thinking, I threw my shoulder into the door. It barely budged, the wood splintering under the impact, but refusing to give way. A few people noticed, their confused voices blending into the music. "What's he doing?" someone muttered. But I didn't care. All I knew was that my wife was on the other side of that door, and she wasn't supposed to be there. I threw myself at the door again, harder this time, and heard a crack. My shoulder throbbed from the impact, but I didn't stop. The anger inside me built with every failed attempt, Every second that door refused to open. I could hear muffled voices inside, too quiet to make out. And then, the music stopped. A hush fell over the office. People began gathering around, watching me with a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell is going on?" someone shouted from the crowd. I didn't care. All I cared about was that door. I rammed into it again, feeling the wood start to give, just as the lock clicked and the door swung open. Lydia stumbled out before I could react. She was completely naked, her clothes nowhere in sight. Her hair was disheveled, and she was drenched in sweat. The sharp stench of alcohol radiated off her. For a second, she just stood there, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. Then, as if the weight of the moment hit her all at once, she crumpled to the ground, her bare skin hitting the cold office floor. I stood there, frozen, as shame and disbelief washed over me like a tidal wave. The crowd around us gasped. People whispered, others shouted in shock. Someone called her name, but all I could do was stare at her, my wife, curled on the floor, too drunk to even cover herself. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. The shame was unbearable. She was exposed, vulnerable in front of her coworkers, in front of me. And Kevin strolled out of the office a second later, pulling his shirt over his head with a lazy, smug grin. He didn't seem the least bit embarrassed. If anything, he looked amused, as if this was just another game to him. The sight of him standing there, completely unfazed, while Lydia lay helpless on the floor, ignited something deep inside me. The shame I felt was quickly swallowed by fury. The moment Lydia crumpled to the floor, I snapped out of my shock. My body moved on instinct. I tore off my shirt, kneeling down to cover her. She was shaking, eyes glassy and unfocused, too intoxicated to say a word. I felt heat rise to my face, not from anger, but from the sheer humiliation of seeing her like that, sprawled out in front of everyone. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, murmurs spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I wanted to disappear, to erase this moment from existence. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, was lying naked on the floor at the office party she'd planned. And there I was, struggling to wrap her in my own shirt because I couldn't even find her clothes. As I pulled the fabric over her trembling shoulders, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. I looked up, and there he was, Kevin, standing at the door, smug and unbothered, as if none of this meant anything. His lips curled into the kind of grin that told me he found this all amusing. Something inside me snapped. I surged to my feet without thinking, charging at him. Grabbing him by the hair, I slammed him against the door frame, rage pouring out of me in waves. "What the hell are you doing?" I roared, the words tearing from my throat. "What have you done to her?" He flailed in my grip, his hands scrambling to push me off. She took them herself," he stammered, struggling against my grip. "I didn't. She wanted to." I knew exactly what them meant. Pills. Something to dull her senses, to make her vulnerable. A knot twisted deep in my gut, sickening and cold. The man had drugged my wife. Whether she'd known it or not, whether she thought it was harmless or something else, none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had taken advantage of her. And now, here he was trying to weasel his way out of it. Before I could react, Brian, still drunk but furious, shoved his way past the onlookers and threw a wild punch at Kevin's jaw. Kevin stumbled backward, clutching his face, his smug expression gone. "You bastard!" Brian shouted, his face red with anger. "You think you could just get away with this?" I lunged at Kevin again, pinning him to the wall. My fist shook as I grabbed him by the collar, screaming in his face. "You drugged her, didn't you? You locked her in there? What the hell did you do to her?" Kevin's protest became desperate. She asked for it. I didn't do anything she didn't want." "Liar!" Brian yelled, throwing another punch, his knuckles cracking against Kevin's cheek. The scene spiraled into chaos. The office, once filled with laughter and music, was now silent except for our shouting. People backed away, unsure whether to intervene or run. I could feel their eyes on me, on Lydia, on Kevin. The shame boiled inside me, thick and suffocating. I couldn't believe this was happening. My wife, laid bare for all to see. And this was how our colleagues would remember her. Get out! I roared at the onlookers, my voice raw and shaking. Get the hell out! All of you! They hesitated at first, whispering among themselves. But the anger in my voice left no room for argument. One by one, they trickled out, stealing nervous glances as they went. Within moments, the office was nearly empty, the stench of spilled alcohol and stale sweat hanging in the air. I turned back to Lydia, still slumped on the floor, her breathing shallow and uneven. I scanned the room frantically, hoping to find her clothes, but there was nothing. Just scattered papers, a half-empty bottle of wine, and a pair of Kevin's shoes kicked off in the corner. I clenched my jaw, my mind buzzing with anger and humiliation. There was no way I was letting her leave here like this, wearing nothing but my shirt. I stormed over to Kevin's closet, yanked the door open, and pulled out a set of clothes, his clothes. It made my skin crawl to see her in them, but I had no choice. I dressed her as best I could, struggling to pull the oversized garments on her limp body. She stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently, but she still wasn't fully conscious. Without another word, I scooped her into my arms and carried her out of that cursed office. The drive home was a blur. She slumped against the passenger seat, her head lolling to the side, as I sped through the empty streets. My mind raced, bouncing between rage, disbelief, and gut-wrenching shame. Every glance at her disheveled form was a painful reminder of what had happened, what I couldn't stop. When we got home, I carried her inside and laid her gently on the bed. She didn't stir. I sat beside her, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. I told myself over and over that it wasn't her fault. Lydia would never do something like this, not willingly. Whatever had happened in that office, Kevin had manipulated her. He had to have. I stayed up most of the night, sitting at the edge of the bed, watching over her as she slept. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke to the sound of sobbing, deep, racking sobs that shook the walls of our room. Lydia was sitting up in bed, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She cried like she was trying to rip the sorrow out of her body, each breath a desperate gasp for air. The sight of her like that, broken, vulnerable, tore something inside me. But anger still simmered beneath my skin, hot and volatile. What the hell happened last night? I shouted, unable to hold it in any longer. Do you have any idea what you've done? You embarrassed me in front of the entire office. Lydia looked up, her eyes red and swollen. It wasn't me, she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her sobs. Kevin, he put something in my drink. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She clutched her head as if the memory was too much to bear. He locked me in that office. I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me. I didn't want any of it. Her words cut through me like glass, but I was too overwhelmed to process them. All the rage, shame, and confusion that had built up since the night before exploded out of me. I grabbed my iPhone from the nightstand and hurled it at the wall with everything I had. The screen shattered on impact, pieces scattering across the floor. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at the broken shards. The room was thick with silence, except for Lydia's soft, ragged sobs. And in that silence, I knew, deep down, I couldn't blame her. She would never do this. Not willingly. She wasn't the type to betray me. Kevin had used her, manipulated her when she was vulnerable. My hands trembled as the weight of the truth settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Without another word, I grabbed my car keys. I was going to Kevin's house. The sun was barely up when I pulled into the street where Kevin lived, just a few blocks away from the office. His house sat comfortably in the middle of the neighborhood, a two-story suburban home with a manicured lawn and a minivan parked in the driveway. It looked like the picture of normalcy, but I knew better. Kevin had a wife, 2 daughters, one in college, one still in high school. He liked to play the devoted family man, always talking about weekend barbecues and Little League games during meetings. As I stood there, staring at the front door, all I could think about was the night before. The way Lydia crumpled to the ground. The way Kevin grinned like it was all some big joke. I didn't care what time it was. I marched up to the door and started pounding with both fists, making the wood rattle on its hinges. My knuckles ached, but I didn't stop. The anger bubbling inside me had nowhere else to go. After a few minutes, the door swung open, and there he was, Kevin, standing in the doorway with a swollen black eye and a split lip. His expression twisted into a grimace when he saw me. At that moment, I didn't care about his injuries or what had happened to him. All I saw was the man who had humiliated my wife and taken advantage of her vulnerability. I didn't give him a chance to say a word. I charged at him, shoving him hard against the doorframe. "You bastard!" I roared, gripping the collar of his shirt. "What the hell did you give her? Why the hell did you lock her in that office?" He stumbled backward, raising his hands defensively. Wait, he stammered, but I didn't let him finish. I grabbed his collar tighter, slamming him against the wall of his entryway. His wife appeared in the hallway, her face pale with confusion. Behind her, one of his daughters stood frozen on the stairs, clutching the banister with wide, frightened eyes. "What's happening?" Kevin's wife demanded, her voice shaky. "Who are you? What's going on?" I ignored her, my focus locked on Kevin. "What did you do to my wife?" I shouted again, each word heavy with rage. "You drugged her. You locked her in that office. What the hell were you thinking?" His face twisted in panic as he tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other. She took them herself. I didn't make her do anything. She was already drunk. I didn't force her. Liar." I spat, shoving him again. The force of it made his head smack lightly against the wall. His wife clutched her chest, her voice rising in disbelief. "Kevin, what is he talking about? What did you do?" "That's right," I hissed, pointing at her. "Your husband cheated on you. With my wife. He drugged her and locked her in his office while everyone else was outside partying." The air seemed to leave the room. Kevin's wife stood there, stunned into silence, her hand hovering near her mouth. Her expression shifted from confusion to something far worse, realization. Slowly, she turned and walked upstairs without another word. A moment later, I heard drawers slamming as she began packing her things. "Wait!" Kevin called out, scrambling after her. "It's not what you think. He's lying. Nothing happened." He turned back to me, desperation painted across his bruised face. "You don't know what you're talking about. She was drunk. I didn't do anything. This is all a misunderstanding." "You drugged her," I said through clenched teeth, fury coursing through my veins. "And you call that a misunderstanding?" Kevin shook his head frantically. "I didn't force her. She wanted to stay. I swear." I could barely contain the rage swelling inside me. My fists clenched at my sides, itching to hit him again, but I forced myself to step back. The truth was written all over his face, and no amount of excuses could erase what had happened. His wife's footsteps thudded heavily upstairs. The sound of zippers and suitcases being dragged down the hall filled the silence between us. She wasn't waiting around to hear more. "You ruined everything," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "Whatever you had, it's over now." Kevin's daughters peeked from the staircase, their frightened faces making me pause. For the first time since I'd arrived, the weight of what I'd just done hit me. I wasn't just tearing into a man, I was breaking apart his entire family. But I didn't care, not after what he did to mine. I turned without another word and stormed out the front door. I could still hear Kevin shouting behind me, begging his wife not to leave, trying to salvage what little was left of his life. But it was too late for that. When I got home, the silence hit me like a brick wall. Lydia was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her face still blotchy from hours of crying. Her eyes were swollen, her expression hollow, as if the life had been drained out of her. I sat down heavily on the chair across from her, staring blankly at the wall. Everything felt surreal. The events of the past 24 hours swirled in my mind, a chaotic blur of emotions: anger, shame, disbelief. Lydia's voice broke the silence, weak and broken. "It wasn't my fault," she whispered through trembling lips. "I don't want any of it. I swear." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words. "I know," I murmured, barely recognizing my own voice. "I know." But knowing didn't make it any easier. Knowing didn't erase what had happened. As we sat there in the heavy silence, a thought suddenly hit me, one I should have remembered hours ago. There were cameras in the office. I shot up from my seat, adrenaline surging through me once again. The cameras, I muttered, more to myself than to Lydia. Her head lifted slightly, confusion flickering in her tear-streaked eyes. What? The office's cameras, I said, already grabbing my keys. If they were recording, they'll show us everything. We'll know exactly what happened. Lydia blinked, her mind still foggy, but she nodded slowly. Okay. I didn't waste any more time. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I sped back to the office, my heart pounding with every mile. The building was eerily quiet when I arrived. Everyone had long since left. I let myself in with my key card and made my way to the security room, where the footage was stored. My hands shook as I sat down in front of the monitor. I scrolled through the night's recordings, fast-forwarding past scenes of people dancing, drinking, and laughing in the open office space. Then, I found what I was looking for. The camera outside Kevin's office captured everything. The moment Lydia stumbled in, already unsteady on her feet, Kevin following close behind. I watched in silence as he closed the door behind them, locking it with a flick of his wrist. My chest tightened as I saw Kevin hand her something. A small pill, barely noticeable. Lydia hesitated for only a second before taking it, her mind already hazy from alcohol. She smiled faintly, as if she didn't fully understand what she was doing. And then the door shut. I leaned back in the chair, a cold numbness spreading through my body. There it was. The footage confirmed everything. The pill, the locked door, the helplessness in Lydia's dazed eyes. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the screen, the cold reality sinking in. Kevin had preyed on her vulnerability, and now there was no room left for doubt. I had the evidence I needed. Without wasting a second, I downloaded the footage to a USB drive and backed it up to my phone. I couldn't afford any mistakes. Every frame was proof of what Kevin had done, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I got back in my car, the weight of my fury grounding me as I drove to the nearest police station. I stepped inside, the drive vibrating with anger and determination, and walked straight to the front desk. I need to report a crime, I told the officer behind the desk, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I have evidence of my wife being drugged and locked in a room against her will. The officer's expression shifted from mild disinterest to serious concern as I handed him the USB drive. I explained everything, what I saw, what Brian told me, what I found on the security footage. He plugged the drive into his computer, his eyes narrowing as he watched the events unfold on the screen. We'll need to bring him in, he muttered, more to himself than to me. He grabbed his phone and made a call. Stay here, he said over his shoulder as he disappeared into the back. About 30 minutes later, 2 officers returned, standing at attention. One nodded at me. We're going to bring him in now. You can come with us to file the official complaint, and we'll escort you to the arrest site. I followed them to their patrol car, heart pounding in my chest. This was it. Justice was within reach. We drove the short distance back to Kevin's house, the tension thick between us. When we pulled up outside, the officers moved with quiet efficiency, approaching the door with practiced precision. One knocked firmly. Kevin's wife answered, her face tight with exhaustion and sadness. She stepped aside without a word, glancing upstairs where Kevin was likely hiding. The officers ascended the steps calmly, their presence a stark reminder that this was no longer just between Kevin and me. This was the law coming for him. Kevin appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression shifting from shock to anger. What the hell is this? He snapped as the officers approached. You're under arrest, one of them said flatly, moving forward to secure him in handcuffs. Kevin thrashed in protest, but he was no match for the officer's restraint. His wife watched from the hallway, silent and numb, while his daughters peeked from the living room, confusion and fear written on their faces. As the officers led Kevin down the stairs, he caught sight of me standing at the bottom. You're making a mistake, he hissed, his lip curling into a sneer. You think you've won? I ignored him, locking my jaw as they hauled him out of the house and into the squad car. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt a shred of relief, but it was only a flicker. The real battle still lay ahead. The trial dragged on for months. Kevin's lawyer pulled every dirty trick in the book, discrediting witnesses, suggesting Lydia had taken the pill willingly, twisting every detail to blur the truth. But the footage didn't lie. It was irrefutable. In the courtroom, I sat beside Lydia, holding her trembling hand as she relived the night again and again in testimony. She was strong, but the process chipped away at her piece by piece. I watched helplessly as she shrank under the weight of the questioning, the constant insinuations that she was somehow responsible for what happened to her. Kevin sat across from us, smug and defiant, as if he truly believed he could walk away unscathed. The sight of him made my blood boil. Every time I locked eyes with him, I saw that same grin from the night of the party, the same grin that haunted my every thought since that night. The prosecutor fought hard, presenting the security footage as the undeniable proof it was. Witnesses, including Brian, testified about the events leading up to the incident, painting a clear picture of Kevin's manipulation. Finally, the day of sentencing arrived. Lydia and I sat at the edge of our seats, holding our breath as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Kevin Daniels, the judge began, his voice heavy with finality. You were found guilty of drugging and unlawfully detaining the victim, Lydia. He paused, glancing down at his papers. You were sentenced to 6 years in prison. A wave of relief surged through me. 6 years. It wasn't enough, not for what Kevin had done, but it was something. It was a small victory in a sea of anger and betrayal. But before I could savor that fleeting moment of justice, Kevin's lawyer stood and requested an immediate appeal, arguing for a reduction in sentencing. My stomach churned as the judge listened, his expression unreadable. After a tense back and forth, the judge finally spoke. Upon review, the sentence will be reduced to 3 years with good behavior. I shot to my feet, the fury erupting from me like a volcano. 3 years? Are you kidding me? That's not fair. He drugged my wife. He locked her in a room. How is that justice? The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on me. The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing my outburst. This decision is final, he said sternly. Court is adjourned. I stood there, seething, my fists clenched at my sides as the bailiffs led Kevin out of the courtroom. He glanced back at me one last time, that smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Even as he was being taken to prison, he still had the audacity to look like he'd won. I wanted to scream, to tear something apart, but there was nothing left to do. The gavel had fallen. The trial was over. And Kevin, despite everything, was going to get out in 3 years. As the courtroom emptied, I slumped back into my seat, my breath shallow and shaky. Lydia sat beside me, her eyes downcast, her hands still clutching mine. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, her, myself, or the universe for failing to deliver real justice. Lydia gave my hand a small squeeze, her voice barely a whisper. At least it's over. But as we sat there, staring at the empty courtroom, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not really. After the trial ended and Kevin was hauled off to serve his reduced sentence, something inside me shifted. The rage, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal, it all felt like a poison that I couldn't shake. Every corner of the city held memories of that night. Every familiar face seemed to carry whispers of pity or judgment. It was too much to bear. I knew we couldn't stay. One evening, I sat down with Lydia in our cramped living room, the weight of everything we'd endured hanging thick between us. She had been distant, quieter than usual, still trying to piece herself back together. I could tell that she was struggling. How could she not be? What Kevin didn't just hurt us as a couple. It had shattered something deep inside her, something hard to rebuild. We need to move, I said softly, but firmly. We can't stay here. Lydia looked at me with a tired expression, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This is where we built everything. Our jobs, our home. This is all we know. Her voice cracked slightly. If we leave, we'll have nothing. I knew this was her fear talking. the fear that starting over would mean losing everything we hadn't already lost. But I also knew that staying would only drag us deeper into the mess we were trying to escape. "We need a clean slate, Lydia," I said, trying to stay calm. "This place will always be tied to what happened. If we stay, it'll keep haunting us. Haunting you. We can't live like that." She sat silently for a long time, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion, as if letting go would mean admitting defeat. I could see the struggle in her eyes, the fear of losing what little control she had left. But finally, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping as if she had been carrying the weight of the world. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll go." The move happened quickly after that. We sold the house, packed everything we owned into a moving truck, and headed to a new city where no one knew our names. It felt strange leaving behind the life we had built, but it was also a relief, a chance to bury the memories and start fresh. We bought a small house on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, but it was enough. It felt good to have walls that didn't carry the weight of our past. At first, it was awkward adjusting to our new life. We both found jobs that weren't as prestigious as the ones we left behind, but they were enough to keep us going. Lydia tried to settle in, though there were days when I could see the sadness lurking just beneath the surface. I did my best to be patient with her, and with myself. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time in a long time, things started to feel normal. The shadows of what happened still lingered, but they didn't suffocate us the way they had before. In this new city, no one knew our story. No one looked at Lydia with pity or at me with judgment. It was just us slowly piecing ourselves back together one day at a time. Then, one afternoon, just as the dust was beginning to settle, my phone rang. It was Brian. I hadn't heard from him since the trial ended, so I answered out of curiosity, expecting maybe a friendly catch-up or some random news about old co-workers. But the moment I heard his voice, my stomach tightened. "Hey man," Brian said, sounding uneasy. "I thought you should know. The house you sold? It burned down last night." I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse quickening. "What?" I asked, struggling to process what he'd just said. "Yeah," Brian continued. "I did some digging, and it looks like, well, Kevin had something to do with it. Word is he hired some people to torch the place. He thought you were still living there." A cold chill ran down my spine, the implications of his words sinking in. Kevin, even from behind bars, had tried to hurt us. The house was supposed to be a grave for the past, and instead, it had almost become a death sentence. For a moment, I sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel fear, rage, or relief. It was a bizarre mix of emotions, but one thing stood out above the rest. It wasn't my problem anymore. The fire, the destruction, Kevin's twisted vendetta, none of it mattered. The man who had tried to ruin us was locked away, and we were far from his reach. Whatever he thought he could accomplish by burning down that house had failed. "Thanks for letting me know," I said finally, my voice steady. "But it's over now. We've moved on." Brian paused, as if searching for the right words. "Yeah, I guess you have," he said quietly. We ended the call, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the trial, the move, settled over me like a thick fog. But this time it didn't feel suffocating. It felt distant, like a storm that had finally passed. I glanced over at Lydia, who was curled up on the couch, reading a book. She looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the expression on my face. "Yeah," I said, managing a small smile. "Everything's fine." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. We weren't the same people we were before Kevin tried to tear us apart. The scars were still there, some visible, some hidden, but they didn't define us anymore. Moving to a new city didn't erase the past, but it gave us a chance to build something new, something stronger. It wasn't a perfect ending. It never would be, but it was enough. And that was all we needed. We had escaped the fire, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged on the other side, burned but not broken. And now, in this new place, we were free to begin again.